Ladies and gentlemen, sorry for the late start. Welcome to this policy dialogue on the jihadist radicalization in schools, universities, prisons and mosques. What challenges for Europe? My name is Andrea Frontini. I'm a policy analyst at the EPC, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion with a panel of distinguished speakers. Mr. Rupert Sutton, who's a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and Director of Students' Rights from the United Kingdom, Manwar Ali, Chief Executive of JIMAS, Rodrigo Ballester, who's a member of Cabinet of Tibor Navracsics, European Commissioner for Education, Culture, Youth and Sport, and last but certainly not least, Stefano Torelli, who's a senior fellow, research fellow at the Istituto per gli Studi di Politica Internazionale in Milan, Italy. We had also originally foreseen the participation of another speaker, Mr. Finn Grav, from the Norwegian Prison Service. Unfortunately, he was unable to come due to a last-minute impediment, and I trust that maybe some of the other experts can somewhat chip in on the issue of prisons, but let us apologize for being unable to tackle this with the fully fledged experts in the speaking panel. Let me just maybe set the scene very, very briefly before passing the floor to the real experts on the scene. I think in recent years, schools, universities, prisons, mosques have all become increasingly dangerous breeding grounds for jihadist radicalization, attracting and leading also to the indoctrination and recruitment of vulnerable individuals, violent extremists, and sometimes even fully fledged terrorists, including foreign fighters. And I think as such, these places remain, if you wish, the very physical places where radicalization might occur. And of course, the internet has become the additional place, a virtual one, but an equally dangerous one, where radicalization can take place across the world. This phenomenon, indeed, this phenomenon of radicalization in the physical places that I've just listed is one of increasingly global implications. It happens in Europe, but certainly not only in Europe. It happens in many regions of the world. We will be dealing in particular with Northern Africa, but certainly it's just one of the regions where this phenomena is taking place. And it builds, if you wish, upon a number of societal and even political failures affecting our societies and other societies. It includes insufficient public oversight of educational curricula when it comes to schools and universities. It involves uncontrolled activities by radical preachers in mosques and other religious and cultural centers. And it also implies sometimes when it comes to prisons the lack of sustainable and, how can I say, strategic, if you wish, approach to the reintegration of convicted individuals, not only during incarceration itself, but also via the probation period. So looking at the, if you wish, the potential actions, the potential players which might be mobilized to tackle this phenomenon, I think that certainly a joint effort between state, interstate institutions, civil society organizations, individual citizens is all very important, needs to be taken, and this needs to address really the root causes of this phenomena, and also help promote a more resilient, more plural, more democratic societies at home in the single countries, but also via transnational cooperation. And we'll be discussing in particular about what the EU, the European Union, can do about this. So we will try to look at these various matters, various topics today, and we'll also try to, in a way, respond to some overarching questions, among which what are the underlying causes of this phenomena, what are actually the causes and also the very workings of radicalization in the places that we will be discussing. How can authorities and societies, can they tackle the manifold factors behind this phenomena, and what actors, tools and narratives can really be mobilized to that effect in Europe and beyond. I would first like to give the floor to our first speaker, to Mr. Rupert Sutton. As I said, he's a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, and he's focusing there on domestic security issues. He also runs the Student Rights campaign in the United Kingdom, which focuses on extremism on university campuses, and he has authored several important studies on this key topic, special focus on the UK, I believe, and contributed to many pieces for leading magazines and newspapers. And I think this makes him a very interesting and timely commentator on one of the issues that we will be discussing today, which is indeed radicalisation in schools and universities. Please, Rupert, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thank you for that very fulsome introduction. I will be talking about universities, as that's the area that we focus on, particularly in the UK. I just want to say thank you for to the EPC to start with for bringing us all together to talk about these different sectors. Now, the issue of extremism within higher or indeed further education in the UK has been part of the public debate really since the 7/7 attacks, and seems to come under new scrutiny every time a student is involved in political violence. We have numerous examples of terrorism offences being committed by students, as well as graduates that appear to have been partly radicalised during their studies, while we're also seeing a number of young people travelling to conflict zones overseas. So what drives radicalisation within education, and how can it be challenged? Well, I think the most important thing to note is that there is no one pathway into radicalisation, with every individual's experiences differing, and the same is true for somebody who's radicalised whilst a student. The process that drives a student to become radicalised is much the same for anybody else, with engagement with a cause before they potentially develop the intent and capability to commit harm. This development is, of course, by no means certain, and most people who engage with the cause don't experience it. But there are many diverse factors that can lead to engagement in the first place. Grievance or injustice, need for identity or meaning or belonging, susceptibility to indoctrination, or potentially the opposite, a need to dominate and control others, as well as being at a transitional time of life or experiencing mental health issues. So if this is the case, and students are no more likely to be, or the process of radicalisation for a student is perhaps no different to that of a non-student, why are schools and universities considered to be a particular risk? The UK government has particularly identified the higher education sector as one that is of concern. And perhaps while the processes of radicalisation are not specific to students, universities and schools do provide a fertile environment for many of the drivers of radicalisation. Personal issues such as loneliness, isolation, which are often common in students, can make people particularly vulnerable to factors such as being controlled by a group or searching for a new identity or meaning. And the move to university is, I think, one of the most significant transitional periods most people go through in their lives. In addition, you have increased exposure to external speakers or activists, particularly those with a history of defending convicted terrorists, claiming the West is at war with Islam, driving those feelings of grievance and injustice, driving a feeling of being under threat, or the them and us thinking, and the dehumanisation, which can potentially cause that intent to commit harm to develop. Now, in addition, schools and universities have a history of being targeted by extremists. Many of whom are well aware of the value passing their views onto young people and the large audiences such institutions provide have. The so-called Trojan Horse affair in the UK showed how people who espouse or sympathise with extremist views can gain positions of influence within educational institutions. And we've logged over 100 events a year since 2012 where extreme speakers with a history of views including suggesting that there's a Western war against Islam, supporting those convicted of terror offences, expressing intolerance of non-believers, those kind of views face little challenge when they appear on campus, often being the sole speaker, presented as a religious authority or authority to be trusted and listened to. I think that finally, large education institutions, particularly universities and large further education colleges, face the same problems that any major organisations do when attempting to implement new policy, whether or not it's ensuring staff receive the same training, the same level of training, ensuring that staff actually get on board with the training that's being provided, as well as ensuring that any new processes work effectively along existing policy. So, The risks of radicalisation within education institutions have been demonstrated, I think, by a number of individuals who've taken, as I said, many different paths towards radicalisation, from downloading and viewing large amounts of extremist material on their own, to organising and attending extreme events with speakers and organisations, or perhaps even bringing the experiences and connections from outside of university into university, creating networks that have gone on to become involved in terrorist plots. But what we do see are examples where students may show signs that could have been identified by staff if they'd received proper training. I think perhaps one of those examples is Hasib Hussain. Hasib Hussain was 18 when he killed 13 people on 7/7. He bombed bus in Tavistock Square. And when police investigated his background, they found that while he was a model student and had very little contact with the police, his school books were littered with supportive comments about Al-Qaeda, and he would talk openly about his support for the group in school. Now, this wasn't criminal behaviour at the time, yet it's possible he could have been diverted away from the path he took had dedicated processes and training existed for staff to raise concerns. The same could potentially be suggested in the case of Roshanara Chowdhury, who told police after her arrest for attempting to murder the Labour MP Stephen Timms that she'd dropped out of King's College London because it was involved in things where they work against the Muslims, and this involved giving an award to Shimon Peres and having a department studying radicalisation. Now, she said the university had been aware of her plans to drop out, and it raises the question of whether staff who came into contact with her before she left the university could have been better trained to identify her increasing radicalisation, and perhaps could have been told that there are processes in place by which they could have raised those concerns. While it's always easy, I think, to suggest that more could be done in hindsight, I do think that these views suggest that these people could be provided with the necessary support before wasting their lives in the way they did. So I think with this in mind, the most important element in challenging this problem will have to be the successful implementation of the new Prevent duty, which has been mandated for public sector bodies in the United Kingdom, ensuring that institutions have due regard to the need to prevent people from being born into terrorism, and that they put policies in place to ensure this happens. And the hope is that this will make staff become more aware of the need to look out for the risks posed by radicalisation, and to know how to act accordingly when they see behaviours that may be of concern, not to be left in a situation where they feel uncomfortable raising concerns or they feel there's nothing they can do. Institutions need to seek to ensure that they provide these policies and procedures to guarantee events which feature speakers with a history of extremism provide students with an opportunity to hear balanced debate on controversial issues, to ensure that attempts to challenge extremism don't end up quashing freedom of speech or academic freedom on campuses, but also to make sure that events aren't one-sided and misleading. And they should also make efforts to ensure an atmosphere is fostered on campus in which students are encouraged to challenge extremist speakers, to challenge extremist material, and feel comfortable doing so. I myself have been to events where people who've tried to stand up and challenge speakers have been jeered, shouted at, in some cases even kind of shouted down and forced to leave the room. I think in addition, government has to work to ensure that it provides guidance that addresses the concerns raised by education staff and students themselves, paying particular attention to concerns about how to identify those who might be vulnerable to extremism without scapegoating particular communities or particular individuals. This should focus on providing information about the processes, particularly once an individual is referred. A lot of people seem to have misconceptions about what happens once concerns are raised. And it's important, I think, that those are cleared up. I think finally, if we're going to successfully challenge extremism within universities, but also within, I think, the education sector as a whole, it's vital that those seeking to undermine the delivery of counter-radicalisation policy are robustly challenged. On university campuses and from some public sector unions, there's been a great deal of divisive and misleading pushback against the Prevent strategy, which is the UK government's counter-radicalisation policy, which in some cases has worked hand in hand with extremist groups. It's included events hosting these speakers where divisive and misleading lies are told about the policy, such as that students will be arrested if they read certain material or if they complain about foreign policy. Telling students that they specifically are under attack from the government and that the government is trying to destroy their ability to dissent or to express their political views. as well as, in some cases, even providing platforms for those who repeatedly defend convicted terrorists and say that they're in prison simply because of their religion or because they spoke out against the system. Now, I think until universities and those responsible for the delivery of counter-radicalisation policy can challenge this misleading campaign, policies in place to deal with radicalisation to help staff understand the problem will always meet opposition from this small and vocal minority, and will always face a difficulty, a PR difficulty essentially, to overcome. So I think while these challenges are difficult, they're not insurmountable. And I do think the education sector is resourceful enough to come to terms with them during the new academic year. And I think it will be interesting to see over the next year how universities which are now subject to this duty implement it on campus going forward, and the effect that that has on the sector's ability to challenge radicalisation. So I'll finish there, I think, and if anyone's got any questions afterwards, let's hear them in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sutton, for this comprehensive account of the radicalisation in UK universities. I think, among other things, it would be interesting to see what lessons learned the UK could also offer to other European countries, but also beyond it, and something that we can elaborate further in the Q&A part of it. I would now move to a second speaker, Mr. Muhammad Manwar Ali. He's the Chief Executive of JIMAS, which is a UK-based Muslim educational charity, which has been pioneering in the zakat, in the Islamic donation distribution in the UK. After being, I think, directly involved in jihadist fighting, he has gained an extensive experience over 30 years in teaching Islam, in running community programs in the UK, collaborating also with national authorities and with universities. I would leave it to him maybe to give us his thoughts on the issue of radicalisation, I think especially in mosques, but also beyond it. I know that you've also been working with prisoners, so it could be interesting to have listen to your take on this, and in general to how you think that radicalisation in these places can be tackled, and by whom as well. Thank you so much. Please.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. As explained, much of my background lies in the fact that I had been highly operative in starting what might be called a jihadist movement in England. I pioneered a lot of what took place subsequently in the mid-80s, and then I kind of gave it all up near the year 2000. So my experience in jihad and recruitment, fundraising, training, fighting covers about 15 years at the minimum. I don't think I have many solutions to offer except some comments from my experience, and I think many heads together is better. Many heads of average intelligence is better than one or two geniuses trying to, prescribe things. And we don't have to be all Muslims or non-Muslims, just being human, being people with the right heart and intention is sufficient. The first point I'd like to make is that mosques don't often contribute to radicalization in a direct manner. They do so in an indirect manner because they lack the capacity to answer questions, to talk with relevance, to guide or encourage our young people to be productive and fruitful in their own communities or society at large. So through the inaction, lethargy, incapability, they indirectly support by pushing the youngsters who are looking for answers, who are frustrated for 101 reasons, to themselves and to other self-styled charismatic leaders. I was one of those self-styled leaders. I don't know if I'm charismatic or not. So people come up with ideas. They kind of interpret the world events. They try and identify their own kind of self-esteem and worth in the context of world events and world affairs. And then they subscribe to a narrative or a discourse. So the first point, following on from that denial of mosques being the main focus of direct problem, is that we need to understand the Muslims, the few and far between as they could be, their mindset, what drives them more than tell them our story. Because some of them have already been properly integrated. I myself did not suffer from poverty, let's say, or being poor in the normal sense. I don't exactly come from a deprived family circumstances, neither from the point of view of education or the livelihood that my father used to earn being a professor, and he worked in Saudi Arabia, so he earned a lot of money tax-free, and so on and so forth. So I had university education, I lived for a long time, I was well integrated, happily married. The first time I went off to fight, I had 6 children. So somehow I detached myself from the community. I grew an aversion towards my country. I began to foster hate and cultivate it, and became convinced that the path of violence based on hatred for a vision or an ideology was the right thing to do. So that brings me to the crux of the matter. The matter is we need an explanation, a way of thinking, a counter-narrative that sets the reality home in a proper manner. So I'm going to go through 9 points very quickly. That understand the goals of Al-Qaeda. I had not even heard of Osama bin Laden until I opened the newspaper, the Guardian paper, at work. I used to work at BT at that time, British Telecom. And I said, who's this guy? I knew of Abdullah ibn Azzam, and my black scarves are from his camp, and I was with the Arab Mujahideen, and I fought in Afghanistan, in Kunar and Nangarhar and places like that. Never heard of bin Laden. So I was never an Al-Qaeda supporter. I was with Lashkar Taiba eventually. But before that, with Jama'at al-Da'wa ila al-Quran wa Sunnah, an outfit from Kunar by Sheikh Jamilur Rahman, ostensibly supported by the Saudi government and then by extension the Americans. The goals of Al-Qaeda is that the world is unjust, that the Muslims have fallen away from true Islam, they're deviated. The Muslims and Islam are under attack everywhere, and what we need to offset all that and restore balance is to establish the caliphate. To restore the caliphate, we need to wage jihad, armed struggle. When it comes to Al-Qaeda thinks they and their followers are the only true people doing it in the right way. Other groups think similarly. And those who are not supporting Al-Qaeda are supporting the oppressors. Well, that was my worldview in those days as well. And I was not Al-Qaeda. It is the ideology. So there are preachers, there are speakers, there are activists, there are peer group people who foster this idea. The world is unjust, the West is corrupt, our government are illegitimate, they don't represent people, they're detached. Islam is the answer, it's a catch-all kind of slogan, devoid of substance and nuance. And they embark on a struggle. Some of them subscribe to armed violence, some of them don't, but all of them support the idea of jihad in terms of physical violence. They latch onto certain master narratives, and we in the West, people who are happy to be human beings and civilized, they need to be very clear about their values and how to explain or educate truthfully, objectively, with academic rigor or honesty, those master narratives. For example, something from the Crusades. They will attach that the whole period of the Crusade, which wasn't a single incident, over a whole period of hundreds of years, to an isolated incident happening today. Could be a misconstrued, a kind of unwise comment from Mr. Bush saying the crusade, word crusade, to something that happens in Pakistan, and tie it all together in a single narrative saying that is proof positive that there is a war on since the time immemorial, medieval times till now, to wipe out Islam and foist Christendom upon us. So the first, as Rupert said, the Islamists or the extremists are ruthless about identity formation. And I want to expand on, that's the first point. I want to expand on that. Of the 9 points, the first one, extremists are ruthless and about identity formation. I formed an identity and fostered it upon other people, saying, you are a Muslim, be as close to the way of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, die in his path and you go to heaven. So I fought for martyrdom. Secondly, their aim is always to entrench separation by divisively constructing the idea of us and them. Rupert mentioned that as well. The us and them, I found through experience, through reflection, self-knowledge, through greater knowledge, if you like, having read more books, non-Muslim books, this idea is absolutely false. There is no us and them. But they will foster that. They'll create a sameness, lumping everyone together under one, the kuffar, the disbelievers, or the enemy. And they will also do the same thing with Muslims. Forget the Shia-Sunni divide, let alone that. They will ignore all the subsects, sub-denominational divides. The Sufi, the Salafi, those who follow a school of thought, those who don't. All of these things merge into one, the Muslim Ummah. This mythical, glorious Ummah who had a mythical, glorious past, for whom we now have to restore power and glory for a mythical future. So they will use words like imperialism, colonialism a great deal in their narratives, to evoke memory, to create hate and separation, to carry on a legacy of we need to avenge, we need to try and be people who can undo, but more than that, punish those for what they had done to us in the past. And they meaning them, and us meaning the Muslims. So that them and us is always weaved in. What about the Muslims who support? I mean, there could be intellectuals, imams even, enlightened imams, who are reasonable, who use reason to understand how to be better human beings and live and try to live peacefully and fruitfully with one another. Well, they will say, well, the kuffar or the Western governments and the allies are the enemy, but these are our enemies at home, we've got to deal with them. So they will create the us and them by pushing all the Muslims who don't subscribe to their views to the side of the enemy and make them the near enemy. So the rulers are corrupt, they are spineless because they can't stand up to the challenges we face from the onslaught of Western exploitation. And they are corrupt and spineless because they are given aid by the foreign governments, meaning non-Muslims. So they don't represent the people, they must be toppled. All Islamists, be it Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Jamaat Islami, whatever disguise they have now adopted, they all subscribe to this quest to establish an Islamic state, because everything else is imperfect and unjust. Some may choose violence, some may not. To me, it's clear as crystal, it is the ideology which is the problem. They would also use the state institutions as tools, and we saw that happen recently in Egypt when the Islamists came in power in the name and through democracy. And they will do the same unhesitatingly. So we shouldn't be naive, we should be kind, we can be benevolent, we can be tolerant, but there comes a time when it's a question of existential issues and about survival, and not being suicidal. The third point is the views are based on shallow worldviews, which are often false. It could be a conspiracy theory about the Jews controlling the entire banking system, to the entertainment industry, to the media. I mean, a lot of it is driven by envy, a lot of it is driven by the incapacity to be productive oneself. The fourth thing is, of course, as mentioned before by Rupert as well, the permanence of the conflict. They have to somehow or other underline the fact for them, it's not a fact, that there is a permanence of conflict between Muslims and the West. And then they will make it even more kind of scandalous or fearsome by talking about how we are on the brink of annihilation and we are about to be destroyed. Now, unless we watch ourselves, the Islam of the beloved Prophet is going to be lost, and all this, to put it mildly, nonsense. The fifth point is extremists are extremely fretful about authenticity. So most of it comes driven by this desire to seek out what is the original. So they're very dismissive about many things. They will improvise, and they will think in colorful ways how to reconcile things that jar and don't clash and don't sit properly. But they'll talk about, well, that hadith, prophetic narration, is weak, or that idea is a modernist invention. And they'll try and pick and choose, being very textually shallow. They're literal. So it mostly comes from the Salafi, Wahhabi type of understanding of Islam. There's hardly any scriptural reasoning. There is no method, hermeneutics being employed to understand things properly. And they'll press into service quotations from scholars, past and present, as suits what their ideology tells them. So imams, mosques, all of us can handle the issue regarding these kind of points by re-educating. The the scripture, they will use scripture to demonize, to make demonization natural. Maybe the far right does it. Some of them do quote Christian scriptures, I know that. But when it comes to this, I can only talk about Islam and Muslims. I've moved among the mosques, and I still do. And I have been, as Andrea Frontini said, 30 years teaching and preaching. Half of that time was, I suppose, spent in doing unproductive, bad things, and half of it now is trying to recover. I don't know if I'm doing anything useful, but at least I'm open and frank about what I say. We use scripture to demonize. Scripture, I mean Quran and Sunnah, the prophetic words, narration, and what we call the Quran, God's revelation, to somehow make the non-Muslims of inferior dignity, to somehow look upon the Jews as accursed, deprived of mercy, let alone political understanding. We will still invoke. Only last week on Facebook, one of these guys on Facebook put up the protocols of the elders of Zion. I mean, come on, we were distributing this 35 years ago. And then 20 years later, we said, oh, this is actually fake and whatnot, and it's unwise. And we find today people still promoting that. They just discovered it and think, oh, this is useful to beat up the Jews with. Let's put it up. And it's on Facebook. And now it's gaining a lot of traction. It will, because the education is not there in the mosques. The mosques, half the imams or more, I would say 70-80% of our imams in our mosques in Britain are not even able to give one 5-minute talk in English. Seventhly, then after all that, they will use scripture to justify terrorism, misunderstanding context, not knowing how to adapt and adopt to current context, using religion. They will have from the perspective of victimization, humiliation, retribution. They will use scripture to justify terrorism. So the counter-narrative has to take that into account and deal with it. What is very pernicious is you see it and you can't quite pinpoint it, but it is there. It seems preservation or survival of the self is imagined in the destruction of the other. That's what makes it so violent, even though they're not committing violence. I mean, they might come and talk about democracy and we should be neighborly and all good, but they actually understand that the only way to preserve is to gain power, authority, and dominate and weed out or wipe out all that comes in the place. To me, Al-Qaeda is no better than ISIS. And we are making the mistake now of wishing and hoping, and it will happen. ISIS will be finished 1 or 2 years. But pushing people onto Al-Qaeda camp, saying, well, that's perhaps a more acceptable phase. Taliban is no better. No Islamist is any better in the end. In the end, they have a greater or lesser degree of fascism. And the final point is extremist propaganda is conspicuous for being in denial. They will not even try, as it were, to see through self-reflection or self-criticism the faults that are with us, that we have failed in some degree in educating, or our imams need to be better qualified, or perhaps our speakers should be better clued up about the society in which they live. We don't even know how to interact properly. We do stupid things. I'll give you one example. In England, most of the Christians are not Catholics. They are not. I mean, the few that are practicing Christians mostly are Anglicans and Protestants of different sects and denominations. And we will do an interfaith event, and the person who will be invited to speak would be a Catholic. Now, what happened here? Because you invited the student in the Christian Union, and you put a Catholic, because we don't even know there's a distinction between Catholics and Protestants. And we live in England, and we are British. And that's for those who are clued up. That's for those who can speak English and those who are doing community work and civic engagement. Then you come to the mosque and you invite the imam. The council does it all the time. They'll invite the imam and say, come and speak, take part in a meeting. The imam just sits there. He's just a figure. He wears his gown and his hat on his head, and he will just swing back and forth a few times. And you will all defer to him because he's the imam. And he's just doing a little ritualistic thing. He just did a prayer or says something in broken English. Whatever the accent doesn't matter. But the communication is important. We can't even communicate to convert or proselytize. And they are meant to be the ones preaching. Mm-hmm. They're not even preachers. So I think jihadist radicalization in mosques, the drivers are many. The solution is better education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali, first of all, for your very interesting personal witness, and also for the insightful take on the ideological features of radicalization, jihadist radicalization in the UK, but I think this can be applied to many other places. Very interesting also what you said about mosques, that this can be in principle the place where people can be reconducted to a peaceful practice of religion, but at the same time many imams, as you said, lack the cultural, intellectual, sometimes even the language skills to help in that process. Maybe this is something we can also discuss later in the Q&A. I'm now moving to the more institutional side of the table with Mr. Rodrigo Ballester from the Cabinet of Commissioner Navracsics. He's in charge of education at large, among other things, of education to counter radicalization, how this can help in that. He has held various positions, I think College of Europe, law firms, European Parliament, and various corners of the European Commission. I think Mr. Ballester's presence today is very timely because the Commission has just issued a communication on preventing radicalization leading to violent extremism, and I trust that you will be explaining some of the main elements of this communication and also how this is supposed to empower the EU's role in helping countering radicalization in the places, especially in the places we have at the core of this event. So please, thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mr. Frontini, and especially to the APC and for the European Foundation for Democracy for this invitation. We're already half of the event, and actually I learned more than several months reading papers. It's incredibly interesting, and so many thanks also for allowing me to learn here. And apologies for the delay, it was all my fault, so it was me, and so apologies to everyone. I mean, if you really want to know what are the drivers of radicalization, I think the two previous speakers are much better placed than we are here in the European Commission, of course. I think they gave us really like first-hand experiences, and we listened to many persons like you, and we tried also to draw some political conclusions and some operational conclusions, and insist on the operational conclusions as well. The three of you, you as well, Mr. Frontini, already mentioned some aspects that you will find in this communication that very much in the, underlying our thoughts here and our reflection on radicalization. You said more resilient societies, for example. You spoke about counter narratives like critical thinking. Well, the last words of Mr. Manwar Ali were like education is the answer. You mentioned the international dimension, the root causes, the complexity of this problem, the need to avoid also scapegoating, misleading campaigns. And a last point that you also raised, Mr. Manwar, is like naivete. Have we been too naive? Here, European policymakers at all different scales when tackling violent radicalization, and now can we do something about it? It's a very indeed sensitive and problem that also raises many thorny questions here. I mean, the political context is very sensitive, as we know. Here we're asking ourselves like question on, to what extent our integration policies ever succeeded in some countries. Some are even asking whether we are compatible or not, whether antagonist values can live on the same territory. We are even, hearing that basically how can I phrase it? Yeah, I mean, again, like the compatibility of different cultures, and I must say that it has been a tough exercise to indeed draft this communication, because of course we are policymakers and we should also tackle everything, of course, but we maybe also have this duty of also being careful in what we say and to make sure precisely that there's no scapegoating or anything like that. But on the other hand, we must also address clearly the problems. This is beginning now for many millions of EU citizens, one of the biggest concerns. And so this is very present in especially Western European states. This is really, I mean, if we now, you can look at the polls, at the Eurobarometer, security is in everybody's mouths. And so again, we should also have like some very frank and some very sincere talks about it. Let me explain you briefly the approach that we used to draft this text, basically a communication from the Commission supporting the prevention of radicalization leading to violent extremism. This is a choral work. So it was centralized by my commissioner, so education, youth, culture and sports, but also with the cooperation of several other services and commissioners, mostly also the colleagues from DG Home and Commissioner Avramopoulos, of course. Here, basically, if I had to sum up this document in three ideas, so it's 16 pages, so it's not so long, so please I encourage you to read it, first of all. First is that's the complex problem, incredibly complex. I mean, you said it, Mr. Manwar Ali. I mean, is, for example, the socioeconomic conditions such a driver? It depends. It could be, but it can actually be totally irrelevant as well. I mean, so what are the triggering causes? Well, that's already the very, very first question. It depends. It can be a combination of factors. It's something that we make very, very clear in the document. Second, it's not a new phenomenon. It's not the first time the EU ever publishes something on radicalization. It's not the first time, I mean, that we even try to support member states in doing that. But it's true that the new trends we are facing are new. I mean, in terms of scale, we are speaking now about 4,000, foreign fighters. We never saw that before. But also the targets. I mean, women and, very, very young people can be the target also of this radicalization. And we are also seeing, I would say, a specific modus operandi, a specific cruelty. Let's call it this way. I mean, it's the first time we see it to such a large scale that persons are, able to sacrifice their life, their own life, just to kill as many as they can. And so those are new trends that really, really are very telling about the complexity of this problem. So is there a specific driver? No, there isn't. At least we didn't find it. It's really a combination of different different drivers, and then again that must be really tackled together. That's why what we describe here is a very, very broad approach. Broad approach from the minute you can stop somebody flying to Turkey or to Syria until the very, very preventing measures that mostly come from the sector of education, of course. We try to cover everything in between. So basically the internet, incredibly important. I mean, if now we have again a new feature on this new radicalization trend is how important the internet is in radicalizing and how much we need to do about it, because you can even do it on your own. You don't need to even speak to anyone, even if the human factor counts a lot. But still, technically speaking, you can get radicalized in front of a screen today, and at light speed on top of that. So internet is one of the first chapters that we develop here. Also research, we need to know more about it. We need to know more about it. Third, prisons, very, very important. And it was said, prisons, again, is becoming more and more a nest of radicalization. When we speak about prisons in this communication, it's not only while you're in prison, but also what happens before, but especially after. The reintegration process when you're on parole, incredibly important. Then, of course, chapter 4, education. Education, and I insist as well, fundamental values. Here we also try to tackle one very political point. I mean, and also sometimes a reproach that we feel in many speakers, among many speakers. What about our values? Did we forget about it? Do we offer something to integrate, actually? When we say integration, but integration to what? Were we maybe tempted in the last years to put our values on standby, for example? Just in case, we don't want to offend anyone. Have we done that? I'm just asking the question. I'm not going to give an answer. But we hear it a lot, and especially from people on the ground. Well, what did you offer? Why were you so shy? Why were you so naive? In other words, why were you so politically correct sometimes? Let's face it, I think this is a question that all policymakers at all levels, I'm not only speaking here about the European level, but all of them must also address these questions. And so inclusive values means that, yes, we should fight for non-discrimination, certainly, and this is also part of the problem, one part of the drivers. But have we done whatever we could to transmit and to convey those values on everyone and to say, guys, basically here, there are things that are not negotiable and things that, that could help you really having also a sense of belonging. I'm asking only those questions. I'm just behaving as if we were not, as if we were off the record. I know we are on the record. That's fine. And also like to create those more resilient societies and to insist also on youth work. My commissioner is also responsible for youth policies. And very, very important, because here what we can do at through civil society. I mean, those are the main actors, and this is basically the third message that I'm going to give you. I mean, we are not here to replace anyone. Oh my God, thank God, no. We are here to support the people who are really tackling radicalization, people like Mr. Sutton or Mr. Manwar Ali. This is our job, basically. And then, as you also said, Mr. Frontini, one of the last chapters of this communication is on the international dimension. Terrorism has no borders. If you want to fight radicalization properly, you should also start in third countries, because many, many of them are facing very, very similar challenges, if not identical challenges. And of course, I'm speaking about Northern African countries, but not only. Look at our neighborhood. You know what's happening now in Kosovo or in Bosnia? I mean, you have some cities in Bosnia where you can easily see a little flag of ISIS. Those things happen. And so again, to make sure as well that we help third countries tackling very, very similar challenges. And they are also victims, and they are seeking also for cooperation in tackling those challenges. Let me give you some examples. And now let me turn as well a bit more to my field, which is education. What we heard so far is very much, I mean, what education can do, at least what can we do to better detect radicalization processes. And it's very, very important. But it's not the only point, it's not the only question. Here we should use also education as a way to prevent what is happening already. And so here I'm speaking about a very, very long-term approach. It means that in the field of education, you can never promise any miracles. You always need to wait. It's 3, 4, 5 years. It's a very, very long-term perspective. It's really like a underground almost type of work, but at the end it bears fruits. And here we can no longer wait, to try to tackle this situation. So one thing is to train, for example, teachers. Very useful is what it was said, to detect early signs of radicalization. Incredibly important. And this is something that, I mean, we might not have to do it in the whole European Union, in all the schools, but we can actually detect easily, select easily some regions or some cities, some urban areas where, or some countries even, where this is really a reality. And yes, when we hear and when we listen to people on the ground, and here in Brussels it's very easy to find them, they say yes, teachers should get those kind of trainings, and also teachers should be trained to better address diversity in the classroom. And when we speak about diversity in the classroom, you just have a look at some Brussels schools where 70% of the pupils are of migrant origin. Well, as a teacher, it's not easy. And to get a specific training on that can certainly help. So again, it's important to speak about detection, and it's incredibly important, especially in prisons as well, where basically the prison guards, I mean, are absolutely very, very well placed to precisely detect this kind of symptoms. But again, let's speak also about what education can do in the field of prevention. Let me give you some concrete examples. Before that, just the third message that I wanted to pass here, our role is to support member states. Let's be honest and let's be modest about what we can do. It's not from the Berlaymont that we're going to solve something that happens on the ground. Let's be very, very clear about it. And then when I say member state, I speak, of course, about the public authorities, be them judges, policemen, teachers, of course, but also the civil society. We have actually 2 excellent examples of that. The persons who are fighting radicalization on the ground on an everyday basis are them. And them sometimes need help from far away, in this case, the European Union. True. And precisely what can we do for them in supporting precisely this endeavor? Let me give you some examples in the field of education, of course. We'll find them in the communication. We have today, we are running, the EU is running now the largest teacher network in the world, eTwinning. It's 380,000 teachers, in kind of LinkedIn, if you want, where they can do, of course, some training for themselves. They work on exchange of good best practices about, how to explain geography, but they can also do a lot about, better explaining citizenship education, critical thinking. What do you do on the internet? What you shouldn't do on the internet? How can you better read the reality? I mean, critical thinking is probably like the most salient point that came out from both presentations. I mean, you need to provide the intellectual tools in the long run, since you're a kid, basically, to resist more, to better resist the manipulation. It's easy, and sometimes internet is a great tool in many aspects, but sometimes it's not. And it's true that it's a really fast track driver of radicalization, because you get too much information, because it's very easy to explain everything you want on plot theories, for example. And also because, yes, it also turns us into like more sentimental persons, and grievances. I think now today youth is maybe more sensitive to that. So critical thinking, incredibly important. And so through these networks, so 380,000 teachers, I mean, this is something that's there, again, you can really provide teachers with many, many tools that they can use in their classrooms. Teachers is rather a lonely profession. I mean, and you don't like to be judged by your colleague next door. Those things happen much better on the internet. And again, you have training already that are prêt à porter almost, prêt à appliquer. You can take them like that. And the idea is also to take this e-twinning network and to expand it to third countries. We actually already did. In Tunisia, for example, 87 schools are already participating in that, so it's not always easy. They have some administrative problems with their own Ministry of Education, but to expand it there, or to expand it, for example, also to Egypt. What about Bosnia and Kosovo, as I thought, and to make sure that kids, pupils, since they are 10, 11, already have an understanding of what we do. Imagine that when you are 10 years old, you have a classroom in Tunisia and another classroom in Malmö, just to say something, or in Madrid. And then, you know, for 6 months they can communicate on the internet, and they can really, you know, do a presentation on Spain and also do a presentation on Tunisia. I mean, how many, I mean, as you said, there's this us and them thing. How many youngsters in an Arab country today think that we're all decadent and our women are all depraved? How many? And how many prejudices do we also have towards them? And I thought, damn, oh my God, you know, they're all Salafist, for example. So those things, the earlier you start working on them, the better. Again, we are not offering here a magic wand. It's going to take time to deploy these things. It's going to take time to also reach a critical mass, but it works. And it's also true that, you know, when you speak to the really counter-terrorism persons, like the guys who have like their hands into security matters, who are resident terrorists, who dismantle the networks, they're the first ones also to plead for soft measures like these ones. So again, another temptation we should run away from is to despise this kind of Care Bear type of approach. Well, it's not the only one. Education is not the only answer to that, but there's no answer without that neither. So that's also, again, a very important thing. The same thing, we also want to build some Erasmus virtual exchange, so virtual exchange networks based on Erasmus, basically the best brand that the European Union ever produced, and also to exchange them, you know, like with third countries, with youngsters. Youngsters are also very, very important. So when you're at university age. Prisons, let me give you another example. I mean, it's, you know, it's one of the classic things that the Commission does, is like this exchange of best practice. And sometimes it doesn't sound very sexy, it doesn't sound very glamorous. But when you speak to all the organization of prisons, you know, like Euro Prisons, for example, the Confederation of Prisons, and so on and so forth, they all say, look, we need to do more on that. And actually, we die not to have like more exchange of best practices. We need to, a prison in Portugal needs to speak to another one in Sweden to know what's going on and what works and what doesn't. Again, this is something very, very concrete that can be done on top of training also to judicial officers. So the justice also must be covered, and of course in prisons, because there you can it's very difficult to detect actually radicalization in prisons because they're undercover basically. They don't wear beards, they don't have like the, you know, the obvious signs that normally could, you know, give you a hint. So again, some specific training there is very, very important. Let me mention the last one, this code of conduct that now the Commission signed with the big internet giants, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, this is also, it's a very, very smart and effective way of cooperating, because now, according to this code of conduct on hate speech, I mean, and also, most importantly even, I would say, the work of Europol in this field, but also in cooperation with these big internet providers, now, like some, not only hate speech, but content that can lead to radicalization can be basically removed within hours or days at the very maximum. But you see, this is a very, very concrete you know, added value that it can bring. But again, we are not here to replace anyone. It happens on the ground, very, very much on the ground. This is really, it's very much in the hands of the member states. But again, through our funds, Erasmus Plus is a mine of funds. You know, it's not only about mobility, it's something that they can also fund many, many projects on the ground. And the European Social Fund, notably, that has many, many billions, you know, to improve education. among other objectives, and also our policy coordination, we believe, and we are absolutely convinced, that we can do a difference also on the ground. And actually, it's not only that we are convinced about it, it's that we are responding to a call of the member states. In 2015, March 2015, 7 weeks after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, my commissioner and the Minister of Education of France called for a specific meeting of education ministers in Paris, 7 weeks after. They adopted the so-called Paris Declaration. Have a look at it on the internet as well. Very consensual, but then what is very clear there is that there is not a mandate, but a call to say, please, Commission, also, what are you going to do to implement this Paris Declaration, and to help us, tackle this issue of radicalization? Well, the answer is here. That's been published 2 weeks ago, barely, 14th of June. And again, we try to be as operational as possible. But again, with those 3 aspects in mind, it's a very, very complex phenomenon. There's not a single answer to it. Second, we're here to support member states. And third, what we need is definitely a very, very broad approach that goes, again, from the detection, which is almost one of the last steps, to the very, very long-term prevention. I stop here so that we can also leave some time for the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Ballester, for these very interesting introductory remarks, for this concise, but I think very interesting, very meaningful presentation of the recent Commission communication. I think I would really recommend those in the audience to have a careful look at what has been drafted. I think it tries a rather heroic exercise of connecting all the dots of EU efforts in the various fields, because it also looks at the radicalization challenge in its various dimensions, thematic, geographic, and I think it's very important also the overall approach, supporting member states, but also maximizing the EU added value, and certainly sharing best practice is one of the many key issues that the EU can actually put to good use. Also very, very interesting, the issue of education. I think education remains key. It is key for the very European project itself. I think it has worked, and the EU instruments to that effect have been working to integrate Europeans among themselves. They should and they can be used further on also to integrate communities which are vulnerable to radicalization. So just some thoughts, and I think many other topics that you have evoked we can also discuss in the Q&A. So thank you very much for that. I would now pass the floor to the last speaker in our panel, Stefano Maria Torelli, who's a research fellow at the Istituto per gli Studi di Politica Internazionale, ISPI, in Milan. ISPI is one major Italian think tank which has worked on terrorism, counter-terrorism, radicalization. They've also been associated to the project in which this policy dialogue takes place, with the support of the Counter Extremism Project and in partnership with the European Foundation for Democracy. Dr. Torelli has researched widely on Middle Eastern studies, political Islam, international relations. He has contributed to many articles in academic journals, and he's also the author of books on Tunisia and the Arab Spring. And I think, Stefano, having followed very closely what Tunisia has gone through after 2011, this also makes you a very interesting candidate to also perhaps explain us a bit what, in your view, the Tunisian experience when it comes to radicalization, especially in these places, in schools, universities, prisons, and mosques, can tell to Europe, and elaborate a bit on that topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for having invited me. Yes, I would like to talk about Tunisia. We have talked about third countries in the previous the previous speech was focused on the importance of cooperation with third countries too, and so I think that Tunisia could be an interesting example for a lot of reasons. I think that first of all, Tunisia, as you stressed, presents some similarities with European context with European countries, and I think even that Tunisia could be one of the countries with which we can cooperate in the most effective way for a lot of reasons. Tunisia is one of the most secular Arab countries. There are no clear sectarian divides in Tunisia, and there is more or less pacific transition towards democracy that is still going on, but yet it is the country most affected by the phenomenon of radicalization. It is the most affected worldwide. This is quite impressive. If you think that we have some 6,000 or 7,000 young people that from Tunisia went to fight to Iraq, to Syria, and now to Libya, this is quite impressive. If you think that we have almost 10,000 people, additionally 10,000 people that were prevented to leave Tunisia, but they wanted to go to fight to Iraq and Syria. You can imagine how huge is the phenomenon of radicalization in Tunisia. And think about a country of 10 million inhabitants, so 10,000 people that wanted to leave Tunisia for fight alongside ISIS in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and so on. It's a very huge number. Why and when does radicalization occur in Tunisia? As we have said, there is no one path into radicalization, and as in some European countries, this is basically, I think, a story of marginalization that led hundreds, thousands of, especially young people, to radicalize. We are talking about social marginalization, political marginalization, geographical marginalization, economic, even cultural marginalization. And in this context, especially mosques and prisons could be counted among the places where radicalization occur in Tunisia. First of all, prisons. This is actually, this is a long story, and it dates back to the 90s, to the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, when hundreds of people were arrested under the Ben Ali regime just because of their belonging to political Islam movements. For example, Ennahda, that now is one of the protagonists of the new story of Tunisia, but also to Salafi jihadist organization. It was during these years, the 90s, the 80s and the 90s especially, that passed in prison that many young Tunisians radicalized. And when Ben Ali felt and a general amnesty was given to political prisoners, some of them funded what would become some of the most important Salafi movements, such as Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, for example. It is the most known movement. At that time, I think that we are in 2011 when Ben Ali felt and the transition began. At the time, I think that the transitional authorities made a mistake because they made no distinction between different political prisoners, and so they decided to give this very, very general amnesty to all prisoners, among them even elements that were actually involved in Salafi or jihadist activities. Under the current counter-terrorist law, we are witnessing almost the opposite dynamics. So under the current counter-terrorism law, we have people radicalizing in prisons, and this radicalization has arose as a reaction to what is perceived as a repressive policy, and to the arbitrary arrests that involved hundreds of Islamist sympathizers, even if they are not openly jihadists. And this goes hand in hand with the transformation of the main Islamist political party, of once Islamist political party, Ennahda, that decided to go on a path of secularization or institutionalization, and decided to make a clear distinction between what is politics and what is religion. From the one side, some of the repressive policies pursued by the Tunisian Tunisian government has gradually led to the radicalization of more and more young Tunisians in prisons. But from the other side, I think that there are no programs aimed at addressing the grievances of these young people in prisons, as well as aimed at providing them with the proper religious education. I think this is very, very, very important. This could be done, for example, with the appointment of religious figures of imams by the government in a way that could be some way institutionalized. And there is another problem concerning radicalization in prison in Tunisia, and I think this has to do with other legal aspects. One that I think is very interesting and could help us to understand the phenomenon. 7,000 out of 24,000 young Tunisians in prisons, so 1/3 of young Tunisians that are currently in prisons, have been arrested for crimes related to so-called light drugs use, hashish use, and so on. There is a huge debate in Tunisia, in the Tunisian society, in the Tunisian parliament too, on the possibility, for example, to decriminalize the use of hashish. As it is reported that many young in prisons for these kind of crimes are at risk of radicalization and are actually radicalizing as a consequence and as a reaction to a system that is perceived sometimes as too repressive. And these things happen in Tunisia today. So you have these strange contacts between these young people that are in prisons because they made use of like drugs, and people, jihadists, Salafi people, preachers, and so on, that are able to engage them in their fight against the system. So I think that this is part of the problem. This is just one example, but I think that it is very, very helpful to understand the phenomenon of radicalization in prisons and what could be done to prevent this phenomenon. Let's pass to the mosques. Mosques are the other great incubator of radicalization. In this case, too, I think the major problem is in Tunisia, as in other countries in Europe too, is related to the lack of controls, of course, and to the presence of almost self-proclaimed preachers that offer a radical view of Islam. In 2012, according to the data released by the Ministry of Interior in Tunis, almost 10% of all the mosques in Tunisia, so about 800 mosques, were led by Salafi and radical preachers, radical imams. And this has contributed to the acceleration of the radicalization process. But in this case, I think it's a phenomenon that is different from the radicalization in prisons. In this case, what is important to note, I think, that is that the push factor that contributed the most to the radicalization is not the reaction to a repressive perceived system, for example, but the effectiveness of these indoctrination of young Tunisians by so-called religious leaders, especially in the remote areas of the country and in the poor suburbs of Tunis, at Tadamen, for example. But these prisons are often unprepared and incompetent. And Mr. Ali, I think that stressed very well this point. What could be done in this case? I think that the government has reacted by closing dozens of mosques, but I don't think this could be the only answer to this kind of problem. I think that a program of training and central appointment of imams and of religious preachers should be taken into consideration, and in some cases is under consideration, but is not implemented too. I think that we have to push more towards this direction. The third field, universities. I think that this is, in this case, it is not correct at least in Tunisia, to talk about radicalization process, but rather of a polarization process. Is something different, especially during the first 2 years of the transition, so 2011, 2012. The university became a sort of laboratory for young politics. So you have youth that has rapidly marginalized by old elite politicians, political parties, and so on, that has monopolized the political arena. And as a reaction, students' organization tried to sort of repropose their ideas within the universities, within the campuses. So they created our own arena of politics in the universities, but there was not a clear process of radicalization. In this context, of course, we have seen some expression of radicalism, but at the end, I think that universities are a place, less place of radicalization if confronted with prisons and mosques in Tunisia. So basically, what we have to think about, I think, is a new comprehensive program and approach aimed at addressing, of course, the root causes of radicalization that we have seen are several, but at managing the risks that appear in difficult contexts such as prisons and mosques. And for this to happen, I think that a joint program of state institutions and religious leaders could be the key to solve this kind of problem. Of course, it's a long path, but at least we have to start from this kind of cooperation between institutions and religious leaders or religious institutions that I think lacks in this kind of countries in North Africa and in other Middle Eastern countries too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Torelli, for this very interesting analysis of the Tunisian case studies. Thank you also for systematically look at the different places where radicalization has occurred or might occur. Just to pick up on some of the issues that you evoked, I think it was very interesting what you said about the need to better balance the kind of two extremes that we've seen in Tunisia in recent times. This kind of very generous amnesty that was given to many individuals who were actually much more radicalized than what some had thought, and the return to a more authoritarian and at least too much of a perhaps securitized approach as embodied in the counter-terrorist legislation which has just passed. And I think the risk of securitizing this issue is something that also Mr. Ballester had warned us against in his previous remarks. Also interesting what you said about the mosques, and I think I see a recurring pattern in a way, the fact that imams can help, but they need to be trained, they need to be knowledgeable, they need to be indeed skilled in order to indeed counter the jihadist narratives and the actions that this might entail. And also perhaps an encouraging glimpse of hope about universities, the fact that maybe the ability, for example, of Tunisian universities to keep encouraging critical thinking, as perhaps given the Tunisian society the kind of intellectual immunity to some extent to counter this threat. And again, and finally, this importance of connecting the state with various actors in the society, religious leaders, civil society organizations, to create really a sort of coalition of the willing to counter the risk of radicalization. Now, I think we have a bit of time for Q&A, something like half an hour. We can stretch it maybe a little bit since we started later in case there is a lot of input from the audience. I would ask those who wish to pose questions to the panel to introduce themselves briefly and be fairly concise in their comments or questions. So, the floor is yours for those who wish to. Please.
Hi, I work for the... Thanks. Hello? Yes, I work for the European External Action Service, and thanks for your for what you say today. I was quite struck by what Mr. Sutton said about the situation in the university in the UK, that more or less match with what I know, and I think they could be extended even to the US university. And what you said, Mr. Manwar Ali, because you said exactly what an imam from Brussels said a few weeks ago about the illiteracy of the imam and the fact that most of imams here in Brussels and in Europe are connected to the Salafist, Wahhabist, and funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Having said that, I found the response of the European Union quite weak. Just to give you an example, I follow some training in the EU, and one of the most important speakers was Tariq Ramadan. Who knows Islam, who knows Tariq Ramadan, knows to invite it, it's like to invite a fox in a hen house. I really hope that the EU, and I work for the EU, wake up, because we got terrorism in Brussels, terrorism in Europe, the number of casualties raised dramatically, and I believe that we should give audience to imam like Mr. Ali that we have here today, because they are the one Muslim that can change how Islam is applied. So my question is to Mr. Ballester, because you represent the EU here. Isn't that time that we really work strongly and we assess our value, like human rights, like equality gender, like rule of law, where that these are not negotiable? Because sometimes I see you like being negotiable on these issues. I think that we must be strong, because by doing that, we not only defend our, let's say, society, but even the Muslim that really want to worship Allah in peace. This is my question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would say maybe we can collect another couple of questions if there are, and then get back to the speaking panel, or if not, I would ask, please. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. Eva Sanz-Diaz, researcher on the Arab world. I did actually my PhD on education in Egypt in the 50s and Islamization of the society through education. And there you can see very well the project of, you can call it the Muslim Brotherhood or Wahhabi, the Wahhabi project, how they had time. For them it was a long-term project and they succeeded in it. How education became more and more religious and became perhaps in a certain way a factor of radicalization rather than a factor of opening students' or pupils' minds. Talking about imams and the religious discourse, I have a question. How come when you read some declarations from Al-Azhar University or the institution, how come some of their discourses is quite close to the Wahhabi ones, or even to the Islamic State, which is now what we're dealing with right now? But I do agree with Mr. Muammar Ali. There are no big differences between Islamic State and Qaeda from an ideological point of view. So what do you do with Al-Azhar? What do you do with imams graduating, having PhDs from Al-Azhar? You can obviously not say that they're illiterate. What do you do with Sheikh Al-Azhar, for instance? Is there a problem perhaps with the way you see the texts in Islam, the nature of the text itself, I mean the Quran, the tradition, the Sunnah? So that was my question to anyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question for the time being? Yes, please. Thank you.
I am Tommaso Virgili from the European Foundation for Democracy, and I have a question particularly for Mr. Sutton. In relation to radicalization in schools and universities, and to de-radicalization, you were mentioning the need to counter to challenge also, and to the radical speech, and to make students able to do that. But what we see in Great Britain, in the UK, is exactly the opposite, because you can see secular activists like Mariam Namazi, or what happened at LSE with Chris Moss, who was wearing T-shirts of Muhammad and Jesus, and he was almost arrested by the police at LSE. So what you see is that there is a self-censorship which suffocates the debate, and especially in the name of politically correct, multiculturalism, etc., it suffocates the speech from people like these Namazi I was previously mentioning, who is a former Muslim. So those people who are usually weaker than Islamists, because they are in danger, because their voices are not heard. So what do you think universities and the schools should do in terms of their policies and conducts from this point of view? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. Any more questions for this round before I get back to the speakers? I think almost all speakers received one question. If I may add one, maybe for Dr. Torelli, if I may, quickly. What I was also wondering is whether the example of Tunisia not only tells something for Europe, some of the patterns that we might see as applicable in a way to the European countries, but whether is the Tunisian case a unique case also when it comes to other countries in the region, or can other countries actually learn something from the Tunisian experience, and if so, in what sense, and perhaps which country you would see as in a way applicable to that end. So I would perhaps suggest that, if you agree, Mr. Ballester picks up the first question, and then I will ask the other speakers to deal with the others. Thank you.
Many thanks. We didn't organize the seminar with Tariq Ramadan. It's probably so not in the commission. No, but I think, I mean, this is one of the questions that I try also to put in the debate. I mean, when I said very bluntly, okay, have we been too naive? Have we been too politically correct? Basically, you're asking me the same question. I would have preferred not to give an answer, but now there you go. Well, I do believe we indeed put for many, many years our values on standby, on the use, thinking that actually standing for our values was a way could be offending to many, to minorities, to cultural minorities. And I think it's a mistake. So I'm speaking for myself. Camera, it's only me, no one else. But yes, and I think that actually the best kind of hospitality that you can give is also to offer what you have, the best you have, and in our case, it's our values. And it's true that here, those are, questions that now became extremely political. And it's true that we often hear that political leaders in general, and I think here we should not only target the European layer. We can speak, also about the very, very local one. For example, places that we know well. That yes, did we allow somehow like the creation of parallel societies, for example? Was like this kind of very, very present alleged political correctness really allow us, prevent us from, like policymakers in at all levels, to take some courageous decisions? Maybe. At least, let's face it, this is one of the classic criticisms that we receive today. A most concrete answer now, in this communication you will find also quite a lot of narrative on values, and actually even a very specific initiative that we will table in 2017. It's called the Council Recommendations, basically in the field of education, which is the kingdom of subsidiarity, where everything lies on the responsibilities of the member states. The best tool we have is the Council Recommendation. It's the Commission recommending something to the Council. And so to apply this Paris Declaration that I mentioned before, that is very much on the values, on some critical thinking as well, the values of citizenship, non-discrimination, etc., gender equality that you also mentioned. So we plan in 2017 to precisely propose a council recommendation to the member states, not to define what the EU values are. This is certainly not our role, but to again support member states in better implementing them at grassroots level. But actually what I like the most about your question is that this is one that I would have liked to ask myself to Mr. Manwar Ali. I mean, in your daily experience, and so if I may, Mr. Frontini, in your daily experience in the last 30 years, especially when you were yourself in this path of radicalization, I mean, now that you looking at your own experience with a lot of distance, do you think that basically the local authorities or the authorities in the UK were normally like a bit shy or a bit, a victim of political correctness when it comes to their values, to the original, to the autochthon culture, for example? I mean, I think I really would like to have your point of view on that. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ballester. If I may ask perhaps Mr. Ali to tackle, well, the two questions. One was, I think, about the Al-Azhar University, and the other comes from our speaker.
Thank you, I'll try. I can only try, it's my opinion. It's not an expert advice, and I do speak for myself, not all the Muslims, as the extremists claim to do all the time. Very short answers. Firstly, you need to be clear, decisive. You need to be strong about what exactly are your values, meaning our values, and assert it with the courage of conviction, knowing it's morally sound, ethically principled, and say so. So I don't know, in answer to you, whether, Mr. Ballester, whether the councillors and people like them have been too politically naive or correct and so on. I think they're protective as well, trying to protect the minorities from other propaganda. So you need to be careful about how not to be politically correct as well. But my point in answer to that would be, yes, I think there has been far too much emphasis on multiculturalism to a degree that eroded us being properly integrated and you yourself becoming confused in not knowing the value of your values. So that's my kind of opinion. But regarding Al-Azhar and so forth, I mean, sister, I mean, mashallah, you got a PhD. I haven't got a PhD, so I'm not half as qualified as you are. And plus, you're from Egypt. But the opinion, the stance I have taken, along with a lot of others who are not much represented or given public time or air or publicity in any manner, is that we have to detach ourselves, plain and simple, from some of these schools of thought or institutions, because they will change, and they are changing slowly or rapidly. They're changing, but we haven't got time to wait for the rector of Al-Azhar to change first, or Medina or Deoband and all these centers to change. They know they have to play catch up, and they're not doing very well in my perception. We have to understand what is our role and how Islam, as Mr. Ballester said, I think as well, should be applied. And we have, I think, enough human intellect and resource amongst ourselves. We lack the confidence, the empowerment, and the support. So sooner or later, we have to carve out for ourselves a British Islam, or European Islam, or French Islam, and things like that. So in a way, given that we assert ourselves and clarify what we stand for, according to proper methodology of understanding Islam, in the rules of interpretation and so forth, some of these areas can be just dismissed because they're irrelevant. Actually, we don't actually teach anymore what Saudi scholars are saying or Egyptian scholars are saying. You don't live in our countries. Part of Islam, as you must know, one of the golden principles is the custom and norm have the weight of law. Al-ada muhakkama. Yeah, where is that? Where is that accommodation of understanding culture, norms, custom, so we can adapt? And much of Islamic jurisprudence in the last 1,000 years have been well tuned to that, despite talking about the gates of ijtihad being closed and all that. So for me, I don't care what you say. You're irrelevant. You haven't got any right to talk and give a fatwa to us living in England, not even how to live as Muslims. I'll finish with one example. I asked an Egyptian scholar from Alexandria, and I said, "Ya Sheikh, what is the fatwa on Muslims taking mortgages, buying and what mortgages in England?" And his answer was with a question saying, "What's the mortgage?" And when I tried to explain, he goes, "Astaghfirullah," and all these kind of expressions on his face of horror. And we are past that. I fell for that 35, 40 years ago. 30 years on, being a grandfather, am I still going to go for those kind of theatricals about Islam? I'm sorry being so rude and blunt, but, ditch them.
Thank you very much. I think next is for Mr. Sutton on the question about universities.
Yeah, I think that the point about kind of secular students and secular activists not getting the protection and the defence they need from the university sector is a very important one. I met Chris Moose, the guy you mentioned, back in 2012 when I first met him. His society had been suspended from the university for posting a Jesus and Muhammad cartoon on their Facebook page. And I think it also plays into other points that we were talking about the defence of our values. So at Nottingham University a couple of years ago, we were contacted by student journalists there who'd been criticised in a statement for creating an unsafe atmosphere on campus from both the Islamic Society and the LGBT Society, because they'd stood up in a lecture and asked a homophobic speaker why he'd said the things that he'd said, and they were the ones that ended up getting criticised for this. So I think what we have to recognise that whilst we say the best way to challenge extremism is through counter-speech, the best way to challenge extremism is to expose it, far too often it doesn't get exposed, and far too often those who try are the ones who end up facing the consequences. So I think what we need to look at really is the two ways that this can be challenged. And the first of those comes, I think, from the top down. It comes from speaker policies that universities are putting in place around these events, around debates on campus. And this has become something that all universities in England especially have to do, following the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act and the implementation of the Prevent Duty. They are now regulated by the Higher Education Funding Council to have speaker policies in place for events featuring extreme speakers. And what these can put in place, and something we've recommended in our own model speaker policy, is to make sure that as the grade or kind of the concern increases about a speaker, that you have frameworks in place to put certain, different things into place to match that. So you would start, for example, with saying, well, why don't we make sure we have an independent moderator at this event to make sure that the speaker can't just take questions from people that he wants to listen to. He can't avoid the questions from people that will try and criticise him. Then you can say, why don't we make sure that we put extra security in place at this event so that people who turn up to talk on these issues feel comfortable talking about them. And as you get more serious, you can say, make sure we have an opposing speaker on the platform. So rather than just one speaker giving their views, they can be challenged not just from the floor, but by somebody on the platform. And this is mandated by the university's policy. And also that this is taken out of the hands of the student union in question that perhaps tried to ban Mariam Namazi from speaking at Warwick University last year, or student unions that have targeted student journalists for trying to expose extreme speakers. Take it out of their hands and put it in the hands of university officials. So that's one way you can do it. But you can also come from the other side, which is the civil society side. So a few months ago, I was at a protest outside the headquarters of the National Union of Students near King's Cross, where Mariam Namazi spoke. We had Peter Tatchell speaking. We got a big crowd of people outside the organisation to say the way that you've been treating speakers like Mariam, like Peter Tatchell, is outrageous. That you're more concerned about targeting them than you are concerned with targeting speakers like Moazzam Beg of Cage. And get 150, 200 people outside the office to shame them, make sure it's on BBC London, make sure that it goes into the papers. And so both by, I think, empowering that civil society action, working with those groups that are trying to make sure that students are given the opportunity to challenge extremism, and also providing that policy advice to government to say, look, these are the concerns universities have about freedom of speech, these are the concerns they have about how well they can effectively challenge extremism. Make sure that you incorporate those into any requirements you have for their speaker policies. When you work with those two things together in tandem, I think that's a way that we can work to perhaps push back against extremist influence on campus, and also the fears that students have about being the ones to stand up and speak out.
Thank you very much. Dr. Torelli, may I ask you for your...
I will be very, very quick regarding your question. I think that before we can talk about the Tunisian model, and I have to say that I don't like to use the term model because every country, every context has its own particularities. But assuming that we can talk about models in general, I think that before we can label Tunisia as a model for other countries, I think that we have to wait that for the process of transformation and democratization and so on to conclude, because the transition process of Tunisia towards democracy, we hope, or towards we don't know what, is still ongoing. So I think that we have to, we don't have to rush. We have to wait and to understand what will be the end of the story, and then we could understand if we could talk about a model and which country could follow that model.
Thank you. That sounds like a wise approach, I would say. Is anybody willing to make further comment, pose another question to the speaking panel? We still have some minutes, and it's good to maybe take advantage of that. Yes, please.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you all. Marta Lomana from the European Institute of Peace. I am wondering if when combating radicalization and trying to advocate for moderate Islam, if we were to label it somehow, since there is no, well, I would phrase it otherwise, since there is, Islam needs to be interpreted, let's say, does that make it more difficult because there's not a single voice or authority that can say this is the right thing to say and this is the narrative that should be, you know, held no matter if we are in Tunisia, in UK, in France, or like how do you address that? Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, this question would be for someone in particular.
Whoever.
Okay. Thank you. Any other question or remarks? All right. So, yeah. Okay. Please. Thank you so much.
Yeah, many thanks for this question. Actually, it's also one of the ones that I keep on having on my head. I mean, to put it bluntly, yeah, there's no pope in Islam, and that also, and there's no structure most of the time, and so it's also very, very difficult. And it's true that, I mean, this is a recurrent problem. I mean, there you had some tries already in France, notably to have an Islam de France. Did it work or not? I mean, how many now Muslims feel represented by the Conseil représentatif des institutions islamiques? Well, according to what we hear, not that many, or yes, but at least not all of them. And it's true that, you know, it was a very, very noble intention, but that is indeed very, very difficult to implement. So far, the experience we heard of, and I say it in whole modesty, are very, very difficult to implement. So how to do that? We don't know, but it's true that, I mean, one of the key conclusions of this panel is that we must address the literacy, the religious literacy of imams. By the way, also in prisons. When we speak about prisons, I mean, it's also one of the classic measures. It's like to have like Muslim chaplains in prisons, because otherwise, who is going to do their job? Like the already radicalized prisoners inside the prison. So you also need to work on this counter narrative there. Counter narrative, by the way, the public decision makers should do all they can to support the creation of this counter narrative, but maybe not to draft them, by the way. It's also something that should come from the grassroots level. And actually it also applies to the private sector. We had a colloquium on radicalization and education 1 month ago, and one of the big conclusions we heard from both Google and Facebook is that they're very, very happy to help, and they do help actually, a lot. And actually to basically promote this counter-radicalization and to display them in that networks, but not to draft them. It's not for them to produce this counter-radicalization. And so just to come back to this issue of imams, I mean, again, I don't have a clear answer to that, but maybe another question that we should put on the table at some point, especially for the external action people, is also what are the role of third countries in funding at certain types of Islam in mosques, and what can we do against that. So that's a very, very wide question, but I think nobody can now afford to avoid it.
Thank you very much. Indeed, very relevant question. The plurality of voices in Islam, and also the plurality of supporters of various ways of reading Islam, not always for good.
Do you mind if I
Yes, of course.
One thing that I would quickly say on that question, I think, is that one thing that I've seen in the UK, it's not really the role of government itself to say this is what a religion should say. And when we talk about moderating a religion, I think that's something that, as kind of, whether in government or whether policy, we should be saying that's not something that's our job to do. I think what we should be talking about is how we support the organisations that are seeking to do that, and how we support civil society actors that are working within communities to challenge radicalisation themselves. So I mean, I have friends who have said to me, "Oh, do you know what? The other day I decided to ditch my Twitter account because, and it's the best thing that I've ever done because I don't get any abuse online anymore." And all I could think was that actually that was really sad because this person was one of the best voices we had in the UK at challenging extremism within different communities, but she'd essentially been hounded off of social media by people attacking her. And so how can we make sure that organisations like hers are protected from that? How can we provide support for, actually in most cases, ordinary people who really cannot be bothered with the hassle that they get when they're trying to work within these communities? How can we give them that support? And the other side is make sure that we don't pick the wrong side when we're doing this. So one thing that we've seen on university campuses is student unions coming out in support of essentially extremist organisations that have a long history of providing support for convicted terrorists, pushing their ideas, in some cases actually travelling to Syria and getting involved in violent extremism out there, although not actually being convicted of that. And what happened essentially was this student union came out and said, these guys are the mainstream Muslim community, we should be supporting their actions. And you kind of put your head in your hands and think, what you've done there essentially is thrown away all the kind of community organisations that are working to moderate, that are working to kind of have some kind of influence within communities. So how can we make sure that we don't do that and that we do support these organisations that are seeking to moderate, rather than saying this is what we think you should be doing? I think is perhaps the key to having some success here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sutton. Would any of the other speakers like to chip in on this question?
No, I think we have more questions.
Okay. Is there any other question from the audience that I may pick up? Last chance, if anybody wants to pose another question. Is there any concluding remark that the speakers would like to convey? Any comments to previous points made? Any kind of last-minute thoughts that you would like to share with us? Not obliged, so feel free. Well,
Can I say one or two?
absolutely, please feel free.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity. In conclusion, I think what I try to emphasize is only two things. One is that let us be clear about our values. Let us have conviction and courage in that, and assert them with due politeness and respect for everything else. But let us assert them. And the second thing is that please do not ignore that the Islamist ideology is a problem. I want to leave that on the table. That there are various disguises now being adopted by people who have made different journeys with the Muslim Brotherhood or people like myself. Some of us are perhaps more sincere or honest in their changes than others. We all have a long way to go, perhaps even now. But as a nation, as countries, with our histories, with our achievements, have a little bit of pride, not arrogance, pride. It's part of self-esteem, and assert yourselves, because if you leave it open to all this kind of open-hearted kind of accommodation of so many different cultures, subcultures within the Muslims that are now in Europe and Britain, then we're going to have more problems for everyone, for the Muslims and for yourselves as nations and countries ourselves. That's my advice.
Thank you very, very much for this passionate call. I think it's a nice concluding message for today's policy dialogue. I think we looked at various interesting topics, various interesting places where radicalization is occurring and might occur. I think one key theme that was evoked here and there is that perhaps it is really about the resilience, as it was said on various occasions, of our society, the way we are able to critically think and confront extremists. Uniformity of thinking is a key resource that needs to be exploited, and that needs to be done indeed by the various actors. It doesn't have to be either a top-down or a bottom-up approach. It can combine the two directions, the two dimensions. Someone was saying, I think, and wrote so recently, that all radicalization is local, and therefore also solutions need to be local in local communities, at grassroots levels, with civil society, including students' union, at a more national level, at European level, and that's what the EU is also about. And we had interesting thoughts on what the EU is trying to achieve, but also beyond Europe, in other countries, and via cooperation with other countries. So I think these are some of the message we can take home and further reflect upon. I would like, in conclusion, to first of all thank wholeheartedly the 4 outstanding speakers we had. Thank you very much for sharing your thought, your time, your input with us. I think it was indeed extremely valuable for us. I would like to thank also the partners of this policy dialogue, the European Foundation for Democracy, with whom we are working on this project, yearly project on the challenge of jihadist radicalization and European policy responses. Just to remind that this is just one of a series of events that we are organizing here in Brussels until the end of this year, and we'll come up with a kind of comprehensive publication, multi-authored publication, looking at the various dimensions of radicalization. So we will also be looking indeed at today's theme. I would also like to thank indeed the Counter Extremism Project and the Istituto per gli Studi di Politica Internazionale, who have been cooperating with us on this project. And last but not least, all the members of the audience, thank you so much for coming, despite the other big news in town. Just to end up with a more kind of humoristic note, unlike the UK, unfortunately, I think this problem will remain with us for a very long time. We need to be skillful in the way to address it, and I think a lot of reflection is needed to that extent. We hope we will contribute to that via this publication and via this meeting. Thank you very much, and see you soon.